Alright, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Collision. Daniel here to talk about the new survival film, Lost on a Mountain in Maine. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So if you guys have been around the channel for a while, you know that I am myself a parent. I have two amazing 9-year-old twin boys. And really it is like every parent's absolute worst fear, just to like lose track of their child in a public place. And to do so while hiking on a mountain in the middle of a very fierce storm is like a nightmare become reality. And based on a book of the same name, Lost on a Mountain in Maine tells a very incredible true story of how like a 12-year-old boy became stranded on a mountain for 7 days and had to, travel, I think, over 800 miles on difficult terrain to try and find his way back home. And I will just say right at the start that I really enjoyed this film. I think this is a good film, really from start to finish. I think this is a very mature and just well-executed survival story that does explore like the fundamental human experiences of faith and family that make life worth surviving for. And this film, I think, is like the first theatrical wide release by director Andrew Keitlinger. I think he just demonstrates a very keen handle on what makes the story meaningful and compelling. And before we get any further, I should also say that I actually had the opportunity to chat with director Keitlinger and just sort of, about this film and sort of the inspiration behind it. So I'll drop a link to that in the description below, but I encourage you guys check it out because this is a really good conversation. And in one sense, the story follows a very similar, I think, template to just many other survival stories. You have like the alternating perspectives between, the lost boy over on the mountain and then like his desperate family that is actively searching for him. But just every element, from the acting to the pacing to the visuals, is just really well done. It just struck me as a very confident movie that had a clear sense of its identity and just is very efficiently constructed without any wasted scenes or plot diversions. And in many ways, Lost on a Mountain in Maine is really like a quintessentially family film, both as a film that is made for family audiences, but also as a story that is fundamentally about family. It's a very inspirational, I think, hope-filled story that lacks some of the glossy spectacle and contrivances of many other Hollywood films. That's not to say this film is still very much cinematic, but it's also a very deeply human story that doesn't ever lose sight of those very personal stakes. And the struggle for survival may be the most thrilling part of this film, but sort of its emotional heartbeat is the relational dynamic between the family, and particularly the father and the son, as well as the growing kind of simple childlike faith of a young boy in God. And relying so heavily on a child actor can be a bit of a mixed bag, a wild card at times, but I thought Luke Blum, who plays Don, who's the main child lost on the mountain in this film, I think he does awesome in the lead role, especially considering the fact that most of his screen time is in isolation, just out in the wilderness, without any of the other older actors to play off of. The filmmakers also make, I think, a very interesting creative decision to intercut the drama with archival interview footage from the real life figures that were involved in these events, giving the film almost a documentary type vibe at times. And I will admit, I found the first appearance of that archival footage to be a bit jarring, maybe even immersion breaking. But as the film progressed and I kind of adapted to the rhythm of the film, really those scattered interviews become one of the film's strengths. I think they work to ground the drama in realism and also just give the film a very unique kind of storytelling identity. And while the characters are very much the central focus in this film, the visuals also play a very significant role, because Lost on a Mountain in Maine is just a beautifully shot film filled with sweeping vistas and some very stunning nature shots. And I think despite the very immediate life or death stakes, it's also almost a surprisingly peaceful film. There is sort of that ever-present danger of the wilderness, but also an almost primal joy of just sort of being surrounded by God's glorious creation. And I just personally appreciated the approach that this film took to nature. I think many other survival stories present nature in almost a very strictly Darwinian conception as just a very brutal and unforgiving game of survival of the fittest, where Lost on a Mountain in Maine captures a more positive and I think a biblical understanding. The danger is real, but the beauty of nature just has a way of putting us in tune with our creator. That's a reality in this film that is communicated through some very, I think, striking vision-like scenes in which nature is personified. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface, this, not a whole lot. Probably where there is the most, especially maybe if you're a parent, is with language, because there is some mild profanity in this film. Kind of by my quick count, I had 4 uses of the D word and 3 of the H word and 1 of the S word, which is maybe more than you necessarily want as a parent for a family film. Although in context, it does work for more like the authenticity of this film. For violence, no like strictly violent scenes in this. There is sort of some visuals where like the boy's foot gets sort of bloodied from walking barefoot through nature, but again, nothing overly concerning for that. Sexuality. No sexuality in this film. The only other kind of content thing, which we'll get into a bit more in just a second, is that there is kind of a repeated motif involving like an Indian folk story about the god of the mountain, and on a couple occasions you do sort of see this bird-like deity depicted, although it's always in ways that seem to be very clearly intended to be symbolic. As far as themes, worldview, things going on the surface of this, like I said, this movie is, I think, primarily about relationships. I think particularly that relational dynamic between a father and his son, because Don, who is the boy in this film, and his father have a very strained relationship at the start. His father is very hard on him, even if it does seem like his intentions, at least, are understandable. This is a film that is set against the backdrop of the Great Depression. And at one point, his father says, the world is not going to give them a break, and neither should I. And kind of on the one hand, that instilled sense of this, internal fortitude and strength is instrumental in preparing Don to survive, on the mountaintop. But at the same time, it also becomes very evident that Don really is yearning for a more intimate love and presence from his father. And then probably my favorite scene in this entire film involves a monologue from Don as he is sort of recalling to himself just very fond memories he had with his father, who used to tell them very exciting adventure bedtime stories, and this sort of the sense of loss he had that his father stopped with that nighttime tradition, as soon as he started calling him and his brothers, men. And I think it becomes very clear that it's not necessarily the loss of the stories themselves that Don laments, but really the loss of the time and intimacy that he was able to spend with his father. I think what he yearns for most in this film is just a hug and just to hear his father say "I love you." And kind of the other theme in this, the other relationship, is faith, because Don appears to be alone, but he's not truly alone. And kind of throughout the film, he sort of develops a very touching companionship with God, kind of finding comfort in God's invisible presence, and kind of repeatedly kind of voicing these prayers that just have a very endearing simplicity and honesty to them that's stripped away of any kind of pretense or just showmanship. And kind of at one point, after voicing one of those very authentic prayers, Don stops to listen as birds peacefully chirp in the air, and then he responds, "For a god, I kind of thought you'd sound bigger, but thank you." And like I said, kind of in the film, that connection to the divine is personified and visualized in a manner that may prove to be somewhat divisive for Christians. I think kind of the divine entity is originally introduced as some sort of god of the mountain from Indian folklore, but at least to me it seems more left intentionally vague and open to interpretation. I think more designed just to represent divinity in a broader sense rather than any kind of specific, pagan spirituality. And I think particularly in the context of Don's own faith, which appears to be very explicitly a Christian faith, kind of those scenes I think appear more representative just of God's presence with him on the mountaintop rather than any kind of other, sort of pagan spirituality. So in the end, I just really enjoyed this film. This wasn't one that was necessarily on my radar, but I'm glad that I checked it out. I think during a time where society and just social media and all that just almost seem to have a very cynical delight in just exposing the rotten nature, the very worst of people. I think there is power in stories that remind us of the noble strength of the human spirit and just sort of those crucial relationships that do bond us together. Lost on a Mountain in Maine, it's not a preachy film, nor I think is it a very overtly faith-based, as maybe some audiences may be accustomed to or even want. But at least for me, this is a film that still very much, I think, elevates Christianity and just the love that connects us both with our neighbor and with God. And beyond that, it's just a well-made and enjoyable film. But I think in the lead up to what is sure to be a very divisive election season, I think Lost on a Mountain in Maine is a very timely reminder of just the shared humanity that makes life worth living. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you go check out this movie, or just you have some questions before you go see it in theaters, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about that. If you haven't done so, to encourage you guys, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider. Lots of other movie reviews. Got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast. Got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through World for Christ.